For God so loved the world that he gave. For God so loved the world that he gave. And because he gave sacrificially, we have the honor to show his love and to show his generosity through giving back and giving of ourselves and being living sacrifices. This week is our spiritual formation series, and we are focusing on generosity. And this entire week, we want to challenge you all to learn what it truly means to live sacrificially and to reflect the abundance of God. Today, we will hear from Hilary Davidson, who is the co-author of The Paradox of Generosity. And she will present what generosity means from a social science point of view. And she will also show with a wealth of evidence how being generous and voluntarily being generous actually benefits our lives. So can we give an APU welcome to Ms. Hilary Davidson?
Thank you. It's a real joy and privilege to share this time with you today and to worship with you. I'm honored to participate in the APU community's focus on generosity as spiritual formation by sharing some of my research with you, which hopefully won't be too boring. I know research and boring might go hand in hand for some of you, but I'll try to make this exciting. And I should also mention that if the hospitality I've already experienced here on campus is any indicator, I think I also have much to learn from you all about generosity, so thank you for your hospitality. So many wise religious and philosophical leaders have observed something along the lines of a paradox at the heart of practicing generosity. You know, I was pretty nervous to talk in front of all of you. There's so many of you, and I know that there are even more behind this curtain and in the other room, and I feel like we just broke the ice, which is good. So back to my research. Many wise religious and philosophical leaders have observed a paradox at the heart of generosity. What do we mean by paradox? So across centuries and continents and traditions, we find a common message that by giving ourselves for others' well-being, we enhance our own well-being, our own standing. And by grasping onto what we have, by clutching tightly onto our own resources, we lose out on goods that far exceed the resources that we may have given away. So just to give you a few examples, the Buddha teaches that giving brings happiness at every stage of expression. A Hindu proverb holds that they who give have all things, they who withhold have nothing. The Prophet Muhammad teaches that a person's true wealth is the good he or she does in the world. And of course, this one will be familiar to you. Jesus of Nazareth teaches, whoever tries to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. And we might also think of a scripture verse, Proverbs 11:24 through 25. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he or she should give and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will him or herself be watered. These passages are striking. And much like the other passages that I just mentioned, this proverb flips our understanding of giving on its head by asking us to rethink the meaning of wealth, of well-being, of flourishing, of happiness, what causes us to grow. Generosity is both a gift we give and a gift we receive. This message of Proverbs clashes, though, with what you might say is the dominant message that our culture teaches us and sends us about happiness. That message might be something along the lines of, generosity is a gift that we give away. It's nice to be generous, but we lose whatever it is that we gave away, and we won't be better off for it. So it's good to give if you have an abundance, but if not, don't even think about it. And this cultural myth of happiness insists that we find happiness by seeking our own good and well-being. Look out for number one is the main phrase. And it insists that we'll be happy when we have enough money, enough time, enough freedom to do what we want. But we should only be generous when we have enough. But this focus on ourself doesn't seem to be working very well for people. There will always be a bigger house, a nicer car, a more exotic vacation. So if these goods aren't making us happier, is it time to rethink this ancient wisdom? So we struggle to find the happiness that we seek when that definition of enough is slippery. It's always elusive and it's seemingly out of reach. What we're really seeking is security in this world, which is not a bad thing. But perhaps that cultural myth of happiness has it wrong, and maybe it's time to return to these more ancient teachings, and today, particularly here on your campus, the teachings of the Christian faith. But I'm not a theologian, I'm a sociologist. So I wanted to know, does this ancient wisdom, does this proverb does it bear any fruit in our modern lives? Or is it just antiquated? Is it just a nice thing to say? Is it something on a Hallmark card you give and you feel better? Can we find any empirical proof? Is there any data? I love data. So a few years ago, I was part of a team of researchers for the Science of Generosity initiative at the University of Notre Dame, and we decided to investigate that question sociologically. The leader of the project, Kristen Smith, and I published our findings in our book, The Paradox of Generosity. So in order to learn more about whether practicing generosity enhances our well-being, we first conducted a nationwide survey of 2,000 Americans. We asked them about their generous habits, all sorts of habits, right? Like generosity isn't just about giving money, it's also about giving time or donating blood, donating organs, providing care for neighbors, watching a house, watching a pet, dropping things off at Goodwill. Generosity, the practices of generosity are wide and varied and truly depend on the resources that we have to give, and each of us have different resources. So we also asked them lots of questions about their physical health, their mental health, their sense of purpose, their happiness, how many friends they had, if they'd ever been to a protest. We got pretty nosy. We wanted to dig in deep to find out what links there might be between practicing generosity and well-being, and would there be other ways of explaining a connection if we found one. And so after the surveys came back, we learned that, yes, there is indeed a correlation between practicing generosity and all sorts of measures of health. But then we wanted to learn more about how generosity and well-being are connected in everyday life. So from our survey sample, we selected 40 families across the US, about half of whom scored very high on measures of generosity, and half of whom did not. They scored low. Our team of researchers fanned out across the country and spent a few days with each family, getting to know them, conducting 4 to 8 interviews with each adult in the household. We also tagged along on errands. We went to church with people. We ate meals. I sat at the kitchen table while the family watched TV for one of the families that I interviewed, which was odd. So there were all sorts of interesting interactions. We just wanted to see what people do in their free time and to really get a sense of what life was like for these families. And we learned a lot. So in terms of findings, first I have some bad news, but I have good news that will follow. So first, the bad news. We learned that most Americans don't regularly practice any form of generosity. So nearly half of us donate less than $1 a year. 3/4 of us don't volunteer in a given month. And only about 11% of us have given blood in the past year. So on the whole, as a nation, we may not be doing so well in terms of measurable practices of generosity. But what about those who are? What about those who are perhaps taking a countercultural tack here and being incredibly generous? What are their lives like? What sorts of things might we learn from them? And here's the good news. Those who did practice generosity fared far better on a host of measures regarding physical health, mental health, sense of purpose, self-growth, and happiness even. Now, I don't want to say that generosity is some magical elixir that will solve all of your problems, and by volunteering, suddenly you will be boosted into cloud 9 of happiness. No, that's not the case. What I would like to suggest is that generosity does have proven benefits to people who practice it consistently. And I'll talk about how this happens. So, by giving our time and money and energy in service of others' well-being, we enhance our own. And that happens through an interrelated series of mechanisms involving our brains, our emotions, our bodies, and even our outlook on life. In terms of mental health, we spoke with quite a few people who talked about having a sense of inner peace or a sense of well-being, a warm glow that they received from volunteering or giving some of their resources away. And this warm glow that many of our respondents described is verified by neuroscientists and psychologists who are able to show us how practicing generosity actually triggers neurochemical reactions in our brains, boosting things like oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin, all of which boost our sense of well-being and decrease our levels of stress. So already we're off to the races here. Generosity is benefiting people. We also learned by just talking with our interviewees that physical health might be in some ways a response to the simple fact that by volunteering our time, we're most likely getting out of the house. We're moving around. And physical activity is a big part of what can keep us healthy physically. So we spoke with people who were, say, their son's soccer coach, or people who were doing voter registration and going door to door. So people, it doesn't have to be running a 5K for charity. It doesn't have to be anything big like that. It can be as simple as getting outside of your house, walking around, taking in some fresh air and some sunshine, all of which decreases cortisol levels and keeps us healthy. We also noticed that our generous respondents held more meaningful social roles, and they were excited about them too. They were excited to tell us about being the clerk at their church. They were excited to tell us about coaching that soccer team. They were excited about being in charge of a community art event. And these roles gave them a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging in their communities. And alongside that, we also noticed that people who regularly practice generosity were constantly learning new things, and they were excited about increasing their knowledge. Just by getting involved in a new organization, somebody might learn something new about soup kitchens, or one person we spoke with learned all of the ins and outs of gardening and creating food for a community, something that she had never done before. And this is, it's a very, very simple finding, right? Learning new things by reaching out. But it has a significant impact on people's levels of happiness. Similarly, and this one I think is really important, practicing generosity also expands our social networks and our friendship circles. And in college, it's probably pretty easy for you all right now to make friends and to have groups of friends. It becomes more challenging as an adult when you don't necessarily have a built-in community and you might be moving around from city to city, as many young adults do after college. So generosity tends to expand our social networks and connecting us with people in our communities. Now, so apart from the fact that they practiced generosity, though, the generous people we interviewed were rather diverse. They came from all walks of life and inhabited every social strata. Some were struggling to get by as students or as single parents working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Some were solidly middle class, and a few even had lucrative careers. Some people cited their faith as the motivation for their generosity, and others weren't religious at all. And some people gave money, some gave time, some gave care. It depended on what people had and what they were able to give. We don't all necessarily have endless amounts of time, just as we all don't necessarily have endless amounts of money to give. But what we learned from talking with people is that it's about reframing the way that we see and interact with our resources. We learn to see our resources not just as our own, but as gifts that can bless others. So what did these people have in common, other than the fact that on the whole they were generally healthier, happier, yada yada? One thing they had in common was the fact that they consistently practiced generosity. So unfortunately, the people we interviewed who, say, maybe built a house for Habitat for Humanity one weekend of a year didn't have these same noticeable boosts in their overall well-being. But people who consistently were on the lookout in their communities for ways to get involved, things that they might contribute, that's when we saw people experiencing greater levels of well-being. And consistent practice, let's be honest, it's not easy to be generous, right? I mean, I think that's why so few of the people we interviewed and surveyed are generous. It is not easy to give up our resources for the good of others. And so what I would like to suggest from this research is that by keeping the needs of others constantly on their radars, the highly generous people we interviewed tended to think differently about their resources and also their responsibilities to others, and perhaps even how much dignity they were willing to give people who were quite different from them. So like I said, generosity is not an easy way of life, and certainly our respondents weren't always thrilled about having to go out and volunteer. They weren't always thrilled that they couldn't just go pick up that new purse at the mall because they had already dedicated a certain amount to the women's shelter. There were times when generosity wasn't always rosy, like, oh, I'm so happy to do this. They're human, right? Generous people aren't saints, they're not heroes, they're normal, they're like us. But they have rethought their resources and their responsibilities to others. And by rethinking those things, I think these people have encountered some deep existential questions about who we are. And are we willing to sacrifice some of what we have for the good of another? How much are we willing to sacrifice? Who is my neighbor? Is it the person right next to me? Is it the person who looks like me? Or is it anyone and everyone? And these questions, even engaging them, can really change the way that we think about our own lives and our relationships with others. And from this grappling with these big picture existential questions, we found that people did express a reduced sense of self-absorption, so they're less likely to be self-absorbed. They had an "it's not about me" mentality. It's easy, I think, to focus on our own lives to the exclusion of others, to think that our own problems are so necessary to fix and solve that we can't possibly be bothered by others. The generous people we interviewed tended to put things into perspective a bit more. So we spoke with people like Dale, who, by putting other people first, he sees a way forward in life. He sees that his own problems aren't as bad as they may seem. Or Sherry, a very inspiring woman we interviewed who has fibromyalgia, which is a chronic long-term health condition. Even as she struggles with that, she speaks about being able to reach out to others and being able to forget her own pain just for a moment or two at a time by enjoying the gifts that she's able to give others through her volunteer work. Or Cynthia, another woman we interviewed who's a pediatric oncologist and goes above and beyond to help the families of the children she works with, to provide comfort for them, spending extra hours at the office. She gets into a state of flow where she's no longer thinking about herself or her own well-being. She's thinking about others. And this actually is known to provide a pretty good buffer against mental depression. So generosity also requires people practicing it consistently, requires us to live in a world of abundance rather than scarcity. You can't give in healthy ways if you don't believe that what you have is enough. If you haven't denied the cultural myth of happiness that I talked about earlier of always needing to have enough, if you've decided to redefine what enough means so that we can perhaps redistribute our goods to others. So what are some of the implications for this? I think that the implications for this research extend beyond how practicing generosity can improve our own health and happiness, right? The people we spoke with who are generous weren't generous because they wanted a health boost. It's interesting. So sometimes I'll talk with journalists who are interested in making a case for practicing generosity as a way to improve people's health. And I think that's great. I think that practicing generosity is wonderful. But the angle misses the point, right? The point of practicing generosity isn't so we feel better, right? The point is to give and to love others and to try to secure their well-being instead of your own. So to be generous just isn't about being happier. It's about seeing people in a different light and to see how deeply connected we are with one another, dependent on one another, each of us having a variety of resources to share and to give and to receive. And for our culture and our time, this is somewhat of a radical message, right? It cuts against the idea that we have to stand on our own and that we have to constantly protect what we have and build perhaps a fortress around our lives. So practicing generosity, I think, can help restore our social bonds. Practicing generosity has clearly changed the hearts and minds of the respondents we spoke with. And I wonder if it might do the same for us, especially as we think about generosity beyond things that are easily measurable. If we think about a spirit of generosity rather than just measurable time or money or blood or care, but if we think about having a spirit of generosity in the way that we engage one another, in the way that we listen to one another, and in the way that we share one another's burdens, I wonder if that spirit of generosity might help us heal divides. And perhaps this is an especially pertinent task to attend to in this week prior to a presidential election that has revealed deep rifts and divisions in our society. And as contempt grows across the political aisles, it's clear that there are patches of our social fabric that have worn thin or frayed. And by becoming human to one another once more through our practice of generosity together collectively, I wonder what might happen as we work to perhaps restore those social bonds and to work across division. So I want want to suggest that there are two ways to think about happiness. The first is our standard dominant cultural myth of happiness, that by buying nice things, having a nice home, taking nice vacations, traveling lots, having fun experiences, and that's what will make us happy. So this is myth number one, right? And it doesn't seem to be working for people, because the people we interviewed who aren't generous take lots of nice vacations. They have lovely homes, but there's a sense that it's never enough. Once the home is purchased, well, it would be nice to have another home. And it's a slippery slope for people, and they're searching for good things, right? Searching for happiness, searching for security. But is there another way? And I think this other way is a deep practice of generosity, one in which we take a good hard look at the resources we have and the care that we might offer one another. And we think about what we can give, what we want to give, what we feel called to give, and we live into a hopeful reality in which we're called to serve one another, to be generous with what we have, and to not focus on ourselves so much, but to focus on the needs of others we encounter along the road. And that, I think, is a challenge, right, that we're faced with right now. It's a challenge that we're faced with constantly. But I do wonder if this is a particularly opportune moment to reframe the stories that we culturally share about happiness, and to reframe it around a spiritual practice of generosity and what that might look like, and how being generous might change our own lives and our communities as well. So I get that a lot of you have grown up seeing probably nothing but political gridlock and brinksmanship in Congress, corporate greed and climate change and rising college debt. And I think it's easy to become apathetic and to turn inward and to seek to protect ourselves rather than reaching out. But the safety we seek won't actually provide security or happiness. Empirically speaking, we did not find that to be the case. Drawing on our data, we found that people experience happiness and a sense of peace and flourishing when they turn outward. And practicing generosity, even in small forms, steadily and slowly, can change the way that we think about our own lives and our own goods. And I hope that of these two options, you will join me in choosing the tough-minded but actionable hope that is the narrative of happiness and flourishing through generosity. Thank you for sharing this time with me today.